Pick up a handful of sand from any beach on Earth, hold it in your palm and look at it closely. Really look at it. The official explanation is that what you are holding is the product of millions of years of geological processes, rock broken down by water and wind and time into the finest possible particles, carried by rivers and oceans and deposited on shorelines across the planet. That is the story you have been taught since the first time you asked what sand is made of. Now ask yourself a different question. What if sand is not the product of geological time? What if it is the product of something that happened once, recently, in geological terms, and that happened everywhere simultaneously? What if the sand on every beach on Earth is the same substance because it comes from the same event? And what if that event, maybe the most destructive and transformative event in the history of this planet within the span of human memory, is the event that reset civilization, cleared the world of what was there before, and left behind the raw material from which the world you see today was built? The claim that the sand on every beach is sawdust, the compressed and processed organic debris of a planetary scale forest destroyed in a single catastrophic episode, is one of the most radical interpretations in the entire Tartarian research community. It is also, when you examine the evidence it draws on, one of the most internally consistent. Not because it has been proven, but because the questions it forces you to ask about standard geological and botanical explanations lead to places those explanations do not comfortably go. Today we are going to follow those questions. We are going to look at what sand actually is, at the gaps in the geological consensus that rarely get discussed in public-facing science, at what silica is, where it appears in the world, and why the relationship between biological and geological silica is more complicated than most people understand, at what the proponents of the mud flood and world reset theory claim happened to the forests, and why the photographic record of the 19th century contains anomalies those claims help to explain. And we are going to look at the trees, at the extraordinary claims about what trees actually are, at the petrified wood found on every continent in locations the standard geological account struggles with, at what it would actually mean, physically and chemically, if a planet-covering forest had been converted into the sandy substrate of every ocean and coastline on Earth. Let us start with the sand itself. Silicon dioxide, or silica, is the most abundant mineral compound in the crust of the Earth. It constitutes roughly 60% of the Earth's continental crust by mass. It is the primary component of granite, of quartz, of sandstone. It is found in virtually every geological formation on the planet in significant quantities. The standard geological account holds that silicon and oxygen, the two most abundant elements in the Earth's crust, combined under the pressure and temperature of early planetary formation to produce silica, which then crystallized and sorted and differentiated over billions of years into the variety of silicate minerals that make up the geological record. Sand, in this account, is simply very small silica. It is quartz primarily, along with other silicate minerals broken down from larger rocks by the mechanical forces of water and wind and the chemical forces of weathering transported by rivers and glaciers and ocean currents, and deposited wherever those transport mechanisms slow down enough for the particles to settle. The beaches and dunes and seafloors of the world are, in this account, simply the endpoints of an enormously long and slow geological sorting process. This account is not false in its broad outlines. Silica is overwhelmingly abundant. Rock does break down, rivers do carry sediment to the sea, beaches do accumulate sand through these processes. But there are aspects of the distribution and character of sand on Earth that the standard account explains less satisfactorily than its proponents generally acknowledge. The first is the uniformity. Sand from beaches on opposite sides of the Earth, beaches separated by oceans and continents and radically different geological histories, is remarkably similar in its basic character. The particle size distribution, the roundness of the grains, the mineral composition dominated by quartz, these are consistent across environments that should, if the standard account is correct, reflect wildly different geological histories and produce wildly different sediment compositions. The explanation for this uniformity is that quartz is chemically stable and physically hard, so it tends to survive the sorting and weathering processes that destroy other minerals, leaving quartz as the predominant residual mineral wherever sand accumulates. This explanation is internally consistent, but it requires you to accept that the sorting processes of geological time are so thorough and so consistent that they produce essentially the same end product everywhere on Earth, despite starting from radically different source materials in different locations. The Tartarian researchers who examine this question ask whether a simpler explanation exists. If the sand was produced all at once from the same type of source material, the uniformity would be expected rather than requiring explanation. The second anomaly is the sheer quantity of sand on Earth. The total mass of sand in the world's deserts, beaches, seafloors, and sedimentary deposits is so enormous that the processes of rock weathering and erosion, operating at their documented rates over even geological timescales, struggle to account for it all. Geologists have known for decades that the sediment budget of Earth's ocean basins implies deposition rates that in some periods exceed what the documented erosion of continental rocks could have supplied. Various explanations have been proposed, including the recycling of sediment through subduction and re-exposure, and changes in erosion rates during glacial periods. None of these explanations is considered fully satisfactory by all workers in the field. Researchers in the Tartarian community who engage with this question point to the sediment budget problem as evidence that the standard geological account is missing a major source of silica. And they propose that the missing source is biological rather than geological. This brings us to what is the most important and least familiar piece of the argument, which is what plants do with silica and what that means for understanding where silica in the geological record comes from. Living plants absorb silicic acid from groundwater and deposit it in their tissues as amorphous silica, a form of silica that is chemically and physically distinct from the crystalline quartz of geological origin. The amorphous silica that plants deposit is called phytoliths, from the Greek words for plant and stone. Phytoliths form when silicic acid absorbed through the roots is transported to different parts of the plant and deposited in specific cells and tissues, creating microscopic silica structures that take the shape of the plant cells they form inside. When a plant dies and its organic tissue decomposes, the phytoliths remain as microscopic silica particles in the soil. They accumulate in soils over time and eventually enter the sediment record. This is not a speculative process. It is thoroughly documented. Paleobotanists and geologists use phytolith assemblages to reconstruct past vegetation cover in ancient soils, because the phytoliths of different plant species have distinctive shapes that can be identified under a microscope. The scale of phytolith production in living ecosystems is substantial. Dense grasslands and forests produce measurable quantities of phytoliths that accumulate in the soil over decades and centuries. The contribution of biological silica to the overall silica budget of Earth's soils and sediments is recognized by geologists, though it is often treated as secondary to geological silica production. The Tartarian researchers who engage with this argument push the biological silica question much further than mainstream geology is comfortable going. They propose that the scale of biological silica production that would be implied by a planet that was, within the past few thousand years, covered by forests of a kind and scale no longer existing, would be sufficient to explain the sand budget anomaly. That what we call geological silica, the quartz sand of beaches and deserts, is to a significant degree not geological at all in origin, but is the transformed remnant of biological silica that was once locked in the tissues of living organisms of extraordinary scale. This is where the argument about the trees comes in, and this is where the most radical and contested claims of the Tartarian research tradition are concentrated. There is a category of claim within the Tartarian research community associated most prominently with a researcher who presents under the name autodidactic, and with the broader mud-flood community, that the large rocky formations we call mountains are not geological formations at all. They are the remnants of trees. Specifically, they are the stumps and root systems and collapsed trunks of trees of a scale that has no analogue in the current world, trees so large that their stumps, now petrified or silicified over centuries of exposure, are what we identify as mesa formations, as mountain peaks, as the flat-topped formations that dot the landscapes of the American Southwest, of Central Asia, of the Sahara, of every desert region on Earth. If you have not encountered this claim before, Your immediate reaction is almost certainly that it is absurd. Mountains are not tree stumps. The geological record of mountain formation is one of the most thoroughly developed areas of earth science. The plate tectonic mechanisms by which mountains form, the radiometric dates of the rocks that compose them, the structural geology of folded and faulted strata. These constitute a body of evidence that is internally consistent, externally validated, and does not depend on any assumption about the biological or non-biological origin of its subject matter. This is true, and it is important to acknowledge it clearly. But the specific claim within the Tartarian tradition is not that all mountains are tree stumps. It is a more targeted claim about a specific type of formation, the flat-topped plateau, the mesa, the butte, particularly those in desert and semi-arid environments that show a characteristic structure of harder material at the top, overlying softer material below. The claim is that these formations, which standard geology explains as the remnants of horizontally bedded sedimentary rock layers, where the surrounding softer rock has eroded away, leaving harder caprock exposed, and have characteristics that are consistent with biological origin and inconsistent with pure geological origin. The specific characteristics that researchers point to include the silica content, which in some mesa formations is extraordinarily high, higher than would be expected from purely geological sedimentary processes in the environments where they occur. They include the internal structure of some formations, which show a pattern of layering and texture that, under specific lighting conditions and in specific cross-sections, resembles the growth rings and vascular structures of very large woody plants. And they include the presence, in some locations adjacent to these formations, of what appear to be root structures in the surrounding landscape. Ice drainage patterns and soil structures that radiate outward from the base of the formations in ways consistent with an ancient root system, rather than with purely geological erosion patterns. Now here is what makes this argument hard to simply dismiss without engaging with it seriously. The silicification of wood is a thoroughly documented process. Petrified wood, which is wood that has been replaced by silica through the slow infiltration of silicic acid from groundwater while the organic tissue of the wood decomposes, is found on every continent. The Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona contains the most famous examples in North America, but significant petrified wood deposits exist in Patagonia, in Egypt's Sahara, in Thailand, in New Zealand, in Antarctica. Well, the preservation of wood structure in petrified specimens can be so detailed that the cell walls of individual plant cells are identifiable under a microscope, and the species of tree can sometimes be determined from the anatomical structure preserved in silica. The silicification of wood, in other words, produces silica that retains the structural information of its biological origin. The silica that results from silicification is chemically similar to geological silica, but physically distinct at the microscopic level, because it preserves the shapes of the cells it replaced. Over geological time, this structural information is gradually erased by the recrystallization of the amorphous silica into crystalline quartz, which proceeds slowly at surface temperatures. In recently petrified wood, the biological structure is clear. In very old petrified wood, it may be largely obliterated. The Tartarian researchers, who argue that certain geological formations are the remnants of very large ancient trees, point to locations where the biological structure, the cell-like patterning, the growth ring-like layering, is still visible in the rock. They then argue that the large scale of these formations, combined with the visible biological structure and the high silica content, indicates that they are not geological sedimentary formations but the petrified remnants of organisms. Mainstream geologists dispute this interpretation. The hexagonal columnar jointing that appears in some basaltic formations, and that Tartarian researchers sometimes point to as evidence of biological structure in rock, is a well-understood physical phenomenon produced by the contraction of cooling lava that has nothing to do with biological organization. The layering visible in sedimentary formations is the product of successive depositional events, not growth rings. The high silica content of some formations is explained by the silica-rich character of the source rock from which they eroded, or by the hydrothermal circulation of silica-rich fluids. These mainstream explanations are not arbitrary. They are supported by substantial evidence and by the internal consistency of the broader geological framework into which they fit. Anyone engaging seriously with the Tartarian claim about ancient trees and geological formations has to acknowledge that the mainstream explanations are well developed, and that the burden of proof is on the alternative interpretation. But acknowledging the burden of proof does not mean dismissing the questions, and the questions are real. Consider what the distribution of petrified wood on Earth actually looks like when you map it at a global scale. Significant petrified wood deposits are found in Antarctica, which is currently covered in ice and supports no vegetation beyond primitive mosses and lichens in its exposed coastal areas. The existence of petrified wood in Antarctica is explained by mainstream geology as evidence that Antarctica was once at a different latitude, and when it was connected to the supercontinent Gondwana and supported forested environments. The movement of Antarctica to its current position is dated by paleomagnetic evidence to tens of millions of years ago. This is a coherent explanation within the standard geological timeframe. What the Tartarian researchers note is that it requires Antarctica to have been forested and then transported to the South Pole and frozen over a time frame that is by definition invisible to any human historical record. The time frame is entirely determined by the geological models, not by any independent historical account. If you accept the standard geological time frame, this is unremarkable. Antarctica's position is a consequence of plate tectonics operating over hundreds of millions of years, and the petrified wood is simply evidence of past climates at different latitudes. If you have reason to question whether the standard geological time frame is as secure as it appears, the same evidence becomes available for a different interpretation. Tartarian researchers who are skeptical of radiometric dating and of the established geological timescale argue that the forests of Antarctica may have been destroyed far more recently than the geological consensus suggests, and that the petrified wood is not evidence of an ancient supercontinent, but of a recent and catastrophic deforestation event. This is a significant epistemological claim. The geological timescale is one of the most extensively validated constructs in all of science. Tested through multiple independent methods including radiometric dating, stratigraphy, paleomagnetics, and the orbital mechanics of the solar system. Challenging it is not a small thing, but within the internal logic of the Tartarian framework, the challenge is necessary and consistent. If a global catastrophe resets civilization and produced the sand and sediment covering the geological record, the dating methods that assume continuous deposition would need to be recalibrated against the reality of a catastrophic discontinuity. The question the Tartarian researchers ask is not whether radiometric dating works in a technical sense, but whether the baseline assumptions are secure against the possibility of a recent catastrophic event that would have affected isotope distributions in ways that the standard calibration does not account for. Now let us turn to the mud flood. The mud flood theory, which is one of the foundational elements of Tartarian research, holds that at some point in the relatively recent past, probably within the last several hundred years, a catastrophic event buried a large portion of the prior civilization under a layer of mud and sediment. The evidence most frequently cited for this event is photographic and architectural. Photographs from the 19th century, particularly of European cities and of American cities in their early documented period, show buildings with their ground floors partially or completely below street level. Windows that should be at ground floor height are at or below the current street grade. Doorways open onto steps that descend below the modern pavement. Entire floors of what appear to be multi-story buildings are underground, accessible only by descending below the current surface. The mainstream explanation for this phenomenon, which is a real and documented feature of many older cities, is gradual accretion of street levels over time, the accumulation of debris, the raising of street grades for drainage, the construction of new surfaces over old ones in the normal course of urban development. This explanation is generally satisfactory for most examples, but the Tartarian researchers note that in some cases the scale of the burial is inconsistent with gradual accretion. The degree to which first floors are below grade in some 19th century photographs implies burial of a meter or more that happen more rapidly than street raising programs can account for in cities where no such program is documented. The uniformity of the burial depth across large geographic areas visible in photographs from cities in different countries and different geological settings implies a single event, rather than the gradual and locally variable accumulation that the mainstream explanation requires. The connection between the mud flood theory and the sand theory is the nature of the material that buried the prior civilization. If the burial event was a flood of silica-rich material, a combination of water and dissolved and suspended silica from the destruction of the prior biosphere, then the material that settled out of that flood would be exactly the fine-grained silica sediment that covers the geological record everywhere on Earth. The mud is the sand is the mud. The same material that buried cities is the same material that now forms the beaches. This is speculative, clearly, but it is internally consistent in a way that rewards attention rather than dismissal. The Tartarian researchers who describe a mudflood event are proposing a global scale version of a phenomenon that is well documented at local scales. Silica-rich sediment does not always behave as a static geological deposit. Under the right conditions of water saturation and disturbance, sedimentary materials can flow catastrophically, as documented examples of liquefaction and landslide events demonstrate at regional scale. The relationship between sand and the hypothesis of an ancient global forest requires considering what the world actually looked like before the industrial and agricultural transformation of the past 3 centuries. The satellite imagery and aerial photography that allow us to map global vegetation patterns have only existed for a few decades. Before that, the understanding of global forest cover was based on historical accounts, botanical surveys, and the inference of past cover from current remnants and from the paleobotanical record. What that record suggests is that the Earth, as recently as the beginning of the current era, had substantially more forest cover than it does today. Deforestation by human agriculture and industry has removed an enormous area of forest over the past several thousand years. The tropical forests of West Africa, the forests of Europe that once covered the continent from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains, the forests of the eastern United States, the great forests of China and Southeast Asia, all of these have been substantially reduced by human activity over documented historical time. But the Tartarian tradition proposes something more extreme than documented historical deforestation. It proposes that there was a prior forest cover of a kind and scale that is not recoverable from any historical or paleobotanical record, because the catastrophic event that ended it also disrupted the normal mechanisms of botanical preservation that would have left evidence of its existence. The forest was not slowly cleared over centuries of agricultural expansion. It was destroyed in a single event, or a series of closely related events that was itself the reset that cleared the ground for the civilization we now call historical. The sand on every beach is, in this account, the physical legacy of that clearing. The silicon dioxide that was once locked in the living tissues of a global forest, produced by millions of years of biological silica accumulation in the tissues of trees and grasses and other vegetation, was released all at once by the catastrophic destruction of that vegetation, processed by the water and heat of the catastrophic event into the fine particles that cover the ocean floors and the coastlines and the deserts of the contemporary world. This is why the sand is uniform. This is why it is everywhere. This is why the sediment budget of the ocean basins is larger than the documented geological erosion of continental rocks can fully account for. This is why the petrified wood is found in Antarctica and in every desert on Earth and in places that the current climate cannot support forest. This is why the 19th century photographs show buildings buried to their first floors in silica-rich sediment. This is why the geological record shows a discontinuity between what came before and what came after, a discontinuity that the standard timescale attributes to geological processes operating over millions of years, but that the Tartarian framework attributes to a single catastrophic event within human memory. These are the questions that the sand hypothesis raises. They are not answers. They are questions that resist easy dismissal once you have understood the internal logic of the framework that generates them. The most honest response to these questions is neither immediate acceptance nor reflexive rejection. The Tartarian sand hypothesis requires you to question fundamental assumptions about geological time about the biological contribution to silica deposition, and about the completeness and reliability of the historical record we have inherited. It requires you to hold open the possibility that something of enormous significance happened to this planet within the span of human civilization that has been systematically excluded from the official account of human and geological history. It also requires you to acknowledge that this possibility, however seriously you take it, is currently supported by interpretive evidence and by the identification of anomalies and gaps in the mainstream account, rather than by direct positive evidence of the mechanism proposed. The sand on every beach is made of silica. Silica is produced both by geological and by biological processes. The biological contribution to Earth's silica budget is documented and substantial. The existence of an ancient catastrophic event that disrupted the geological and biological record in the ways the Tartarian framework describes would explain certain anomalies in that record. Whether such an event actually occurred is a question that the current state of evidence cannot definitively answer. What the evidence can tell you is that the question is worth asking, that the anomalies are real, that the mainstream account has gaps in it that its own practitioners acknowledge, even if they propose different solutions to those gaps than the Tartarian framework does, and that the physical world around you, the sand between your toes, the mountains on the horizon, the flat-topped mesas of desert landscapes, is not quite as obviously the product of a single straightforward geological history as you have been taught to assume. Pick up another handful of sand, hold it in your palm, look at it, ask yourself what it is, not what you have been told it is, what it actually is when you look at it with clear eyes and ask the questions that the official account is not designed to generate. That is where this investigation begins, and it does not end with sand. If this kind of deep questioning of the physical record of this planet is what you come here for, subscribe and hit the bell. We follow these threads wherever they lead, into the geology and the botany and the chemistry and the history, looking for the places where the official account leaves questions open that it is not asking. Tell us in the comments what specific formation or location you want us to examine next through this lens. Because the Earth's surface is covered in evidence. The question is whether we are reading it correctly.